Today, I'll be speaking with Dr. Brock Bergseth, who is an award-winning marine biologist and conservation psychologist. He'll be sharing some of his experience working on the Great Barrier Reef, as well as some of his most special and treasured memories working in the ocean among marine life. I'll also be asking him to share some of the quirkiest or unusual creatures from the Big Blue. And without a doubt, we'll be discussing conservation and how it pertains to marine ecosystems, climate change, and more. Dr. Brock Bergseth tackles some of the most pervasive problems in our oceans, such as overfishing, illegal fishing, and poaching. For the past 13 years, Brock's work has examined and shaped the way that people interact with coral reef ecosystems, ultimately seeking to strengthen protection measures and reduce conflict between man and nature. As humanity's footprint continues to expand and impact our planet, public sentiment towards conserving our planet has shifted towards negativity and despondency, at a time when so many positive trends and scalable solutions are emerging. On this note, Brock is currently finishing his first pop science book called Wild Hope, which is a story all about hope for our future, aimed at turning the tide of doom and gloom over our planet's future. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Hi, Brock. Thank you so much for being here with me today. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you. And thank you for inviting me onto your show.
So, where are we finding you today?
Today, you are finding me in Townsville in Australia. I'm at James Cook University, which is one of the best research universities for coral reef biology in the world. And it's located about halfway up the length of the Great Barrier Reef here in Australia.
How incredible. So, you're quite close to the Great Barrier Reef, correct?
I can look out my window and see it every day.
So, tell me, how is the Great Barrier Reef doing?
So unfortunately, the Great Barrier Reef isn't doing great at the moment. It's in what we would call a period of recovery. It bleached quite extensively and quite severely earlier this year. So without getting too far into the details, it's currently in recovery, and hopefully without any more stressing events, it should be able to recover in a number of years, probably 2 to 4 years before we see coral levels bounce back up to where they should be.
So, when you say recovery, it means there's hope, because a lot of us will hear news about the Great Barrier Reef and we'll hear news that it's, 70 or 90% dead. And when something's dead, it's not really in recovery. So, can you explain to us what you mean by a bleaching event? And when you use the word recovery, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, of course. So first things first, one of the most important things to remember about the Great Barrier Reef, it's not one individual reef. The Great Barrier Reef itself spans almost 3,000 kilometers along the coast of Australia. It's not a single reef. It's actually made up of roughly 2,500 individual reefs, almost 200 islands, a bunch of sand cays, everything else. So when you think about it at that scale, it's much harder to kind of get an idea of how much is bleached, how much is dead, how much is alive. But when people tell you 70 to 90% bleaching, what they're saying is when they've gone through and flown over top of the Great Barrier Reef during one of these big widespread bleaching events, which are unfortunately happening more frequently, they're able to go and look and see how much of it is bleaching or how much of it is dead based on the cover. So from the air, you can see down to probably roughly 8 meters in the water, which tells you the top 8 meters, how much of that is alive versus how much of that has died. So the reef is not dead, the reef is recovering. So essentially, a lot of coral has died, a lot of the fish have moved or have shifted habitats, but now we're in this state where it's essentially recovering. So perhaps it's also worth getting into the science of what bleaching actually is, so I can explain that a bit further for you as well. When we talk about corals, corals are essentially a symbiotic organism where the coral itself builds this skeletal structure, or that hard structure that you see when you think of corals. But what it's doing, it's kind of building imagine it like an apartment building in a high rise. And so in each of those tiny little holes is actually where this symbiotic zooxanthellae, or essentially an algae, lives. And what this does is, because it's a symbiotic relationship, the coral gives the algae somewhere to live, and then the algae is what's actually creating the color of the coral. So when you have the coral just by itself, like up here on my shelf, it's just white. But when it has that zooxanthellae algae, that's what gives it its color. And that's when the two are living well together, that's when you have a healthy coral. That looks very beautiful and kind of what you see when you look at a David Attenborough documentary. So when bleaching happens, what bleaching is essentially it's when the water has gotten so hot for that coral that it can no longer host that symbiotic zooxanthellae. So the coral essentially kicks that zooxanthellae out. The zooxanthellae goes up into the water column, and depending on the severity of that bleaching event, the zooxanthellae die or get swept off the water column. And then you have either an instance where the zooxanthellae or more zooxanthellae come back through from source reefs, or essentially reefs that haven't bleached, to repopulate that coral. Or if it's a long enough and a severe enough bleaching event, the zooxanthellae can't come back, the coral eventually dies. And so when it's bleaching, it's white. And when it's completely bleached and dyed, that's when it turns kind of like this scungy brown color. That takes a few years to essentially break down for new coral recruits to settle from, again, these source reefs that haven't bleached.
So what you're saying is when we see white coral, what we would call bleached coral, they're not actually dead yet. They're just extremely stressed. But when we see coral brown, that's when they're dead and there is no hope for recovery. We've lost those corals.
Pretty much. When you're seeing a white coral, there's actually one step that it goes through before it turns white, and it actually fluoresces. And I've seen this in person and underwater, and it's one of the most beautiful, but also one of the most heartbreaking things you'll ever see. Because imagine these corals that are suddenly looking like Easter eggs, fluorescent greens, fluorescent orange, fluorescent purple, some of these most incredible colors you've ever seen. But it's essentially, that the reason it's fluorescing is because it's under stress. If it continues to be under stress, it's going to turn white. And if it's such a stressful event, it's just going to die.
That is so interesting to know that the coral actually becomes so beautiful and colorful when it's stressed before it goes white and then it goes brown. I don't think that's something a lot of people know. And probably, as you said, it's so beautiful to see. They probably think it's a very healthy coral. As an ocean lover myself, and since I'm speaking to a marine biologist who's seen many beautiful things in the ocean, I'd love to ask you, what are some of your most special memories on the Great Barrier Reef?
It's a great question. I've been lucky enough to dive almost the entire length of the Great Barrier Reef over the time that I've been here, and so I'm trying to think about some of the best memories. I think one of the ones that most of the listeners will probably be interested in is I've seen sharks breeding before, and if you've never seen that, it looks like absolute chaos, but imagine one shark that's able to breed and then just a ball of male sharks around another shark. It almost looks like a predation event where you think that that female shark is being mobbed. It's very exciting. People probably think that there's something else going on, but that's one of the most interesting things I've seen. We were on this very outer shelf reef, and I was diving by myself with my partner behind me, and I looked down in this pure aqualine blue water, and way down, like 20 meters down beneath me, there was just this ball of sharks and all of this activity happening. I had no idea what was going on. And it was only in retrospect, after discussing it with some of my colleagues, that we knew that it was actually a breeding event, which is quite rare to see in person. One of the other kind of crown jewels of the Great Barrier Reef is this place called Heron Island. And it's located kind of on the southern part of the Great Barrier Reef. And one of the reasons why it's so beautiful, not only just because of the white sand beaches, but it's also because it gets all this incredible charismatic megafauna. By charismatic megafauna, I mean sharks, rays, turtles, you name it, you can see it there. It was the last day of this intensive field trip that I'd been teaching. We'd been putting in 12 to 15 hours a day. The weather was horrible, but when you're there, it's so worth getting in the water because you never know what you're going to see. We've been seeing a lot of sharks, we've been seeing a lot of rays, we've been seeing a lot of guitar fish. But on this specific morning, after swimming way out past the passage for the boats, I got to the outer part of the reef. And at the outer part of the reef, we encountered this huge group of fish. Like, imagine 1,000 fish from everywhere that you can see, from left to right, spanning in front of you. And what this was is this wall of mouths is what it's called in ecology. But essentially all these planktivorous fish have found this point where the currents are converging and bringing all this plankton in. And so they just hang in the water column and just feed effortlessly. But I mean, you can literally swim for 5 minutes from one end to the other end of this huge amalgamation of fish. It is probably the most biomass I've ever seen underwater to this day. I still get goosebumps on the back of my neck as I'm thinking about it because I can just transport myself back there immediately. I think there's probably two other memories that consistently list up at the top as far as my experiences on the Great Barrier Reef. One of them is essentially due to some of the work that I've been doing. And in this work, we were going into different zones that limit human interaction with wildlife. And so you have, at the most strict level, you have a no entry zone. And these are very strictly enforced, where humans are not allowed to go anywhere near this reef because it's essentially a wilderness area and it's meant to be pristine. Because of that, fish behavior and animal behavior in these areas is incredibly different than what we see in any other place, even like a no fishing zone where people go scuba diving. Very different behavior amongst fish, and especially the fish that are typically targeted by fishers themselves. And so I'm going about in this no entry zone, way down in the Swains, we call it, which is located almost 200 nautical miles offshore. So it's about as far out as you can get from the Australian continent and still being on the Great Barrier Reef. And I was going around, and specifically what I was doing was looking at how close fish would allow me to approach them before they ran away. And so this essentially is called flight initiation distance, and it's a measure of fear in fish. And so you go up, you spot a fish, and then you say, okay, I'm going to start approaching it. And you just swim directly towards it until it has a look at you and turns around and swims away. And so I was doing this time and time again in this zone and noticing that I was getting incredibly close to these fish, like close enough to where you could reach out and literally touch them because they're so naive and they're so interested in what you're doing. They've probably never seen a human before. And while that was really cool, and I was seeing that on my data sheets as I was making these recordings, I turned around, I looked behind me, and what I noticed was that I actually had like 8 to 12 coral trout, which are these very large, kind of one of the big predators on coral reefs. I had 8 to 10 of these things following me along like puppy dogs. So I'd be swimming along, I'd turn, I'd look behind me, and then you just see these coral trout poking their head up, kind of like, oh, what are you doing? And it was just such a powerful experience because it showed me like what natural fish behavior is like, and especially what can happen when we simply leave places alone. And that's a kind of key thread that I'll keep coming back to, is that the natural world and our oceans are so resilient. If we simply just remove human pressure, the amount that it can bounce back and recover is incredible. The last memory I'll briefly touch on is essentially also happened when I was out doing research. And in this case, we were collecting coral trout again on spear gun, on scuba. And under research permitting, this is allowed. Normally it's not allowed. But because of that, you're essentially going around and you're shooting fish with a spear gun, and then you're putting them in the catch bag that you're then hauling around with you. And for anyone that is worried about sharks, this is probably the best way ever to see sharks, because you're carrying around a bag of dead fish in the water right next to you. And so I was swimming along, spear gun in one hand, catch bag in the other hand, and then suddenly the catch bag just got yanked out of my grip. And I turned around, and there's a huge gray nurse or a tawny shark, which really aren't dangerous. They're quite docile. But when you're unexpectedly confronted with this animal, literally less than a hand length away from you, it's quite a eye-opening experience, to say the least. So this shark had grabbed my catch bag because it was full of tasty little treats. So I had to go chase after the shark to get it to drop the catch bag to get my samples back. So luckily enough, I was able to persuade this shark without too much violence to give my catch bag back and went on. But it's definitely another memory that stays in my brain, as far as quite a surprise, and an unexpected surprise at that.
Thank you so much for sharing those. I felt like I got a little lost in some of your stories. I was kind of with you in the ocean and scuba diving and seeing these fish. So it's so rare to speak to someone with so much experience in some of these most remote and gorgeous places on the earth, and to hear these stories, like, trouts acting like puppies. It's incredible. So there was so much beautiful imagery to hear from your stories. So I'd really love to ask you, what are some of the kind of unusual characteristics from marine life you've come across? Unique or unusual behaviors that maybe most people would have not come across or would not know about marine life?
The more time you spend underwater, the more you understand just how much you do not understand what's happening underwater. So I think one of the things that would be fun to kind of talk about a little bit is essentially what we call these cleaning stations on the reef. A cleaning station is a point where you have all these little wrasse that are called cleaner wrasse, and they can be about this big, and they've got a little, typically a blue and black stripe. And these wrasse actually go around and they clean parasites from other fish or from sharks. And so you'll see these cleaning stations. Sometimes it'll be up to 2 or 3 or 4 wrasse at a time. And there'll oftentimes be a line of fish that are waiting to be cleaned. And so you'll see these big groupers or these big cod that are hanging mid-water column with their mouth wide open, their gills wide open, and they're just hanging there looking at you. And it's because they have multiple wrasse that are inside cleaning around their teeth, essentially giving them a dental clean for free. And this is, a symbiotic relationship. The wrasse get food, and the trout or the larger groupers or the turtles, whatever's being cleaned, becomes healthier because they're being cleaned by these cleaner wrasse.
And what's a wrasse? Is it a fish or is it a crab or?
This is a type of fish, yeah. They come in all shapes and sizes, but the cleaner wrasse itself typically isn't much bigger than this.
I've seen something like that with manta rays in Bali, where I went diving with them and we were at a cleaning station because it was a guaranteed spot to see these huge manta rays. And they were actually queuing. There was like 10, 11, maybe 15 of them in line waiting in a queue to get cleaned by these fish. I don't know if it was the same type of fish that clean the manta rays as they do the groupers, but I saw them in single file queue waiting to get their dental cleaning of the week or month. Or is it a yearly thing? Is it a monthly thing? Like, how often do marine life get a clean?
I think it would depend on the species, but with some of these kind of more reef associated fish or fish that really do reside on a reef itself, I'm sure they're getting cleaned much more frequently than that. I've seen some fish go back for a second clean in the same hour, essentially, because clearly they weren't happy with the cleaning that they got. So I think it really does depend. I don't know that anyone has actually quantified how frequently fish are getting cleaned, but I know that there has been some research kind of looking into the evolutionary basis and the background and what potentially some of these services are providing to the larger ecosystem. So another very unique behavior that actually isn't as rare as you would think is if you've ever seen a parrotfish. And so a parrotfish, again, reef associated fish, they spend most of their time munching on corals themselves. And parrotfish, incredibly beautiful, incredibly colorful. But what's really interesting is that parrotfish, you'll often see them after they've been eating, they go up in the mid-water column and then they defecate or they poo. And typically the poo looks like sand. And so you can literally watch sand coming down in the water column. Oftentimes, if there's anything besides sand, you'll see other fish that come up and essentially munch on the poo itself. Because essentially think of a coral reef as like a desert. So they're incredibly nutrient poor, which isn't something that you would commonly think. You'd look at a coral reef and it looks like, wow, look at all the diversity. That must be a really nutrient rich system. But actually it's the exact opposite, and it's a very efficient system. So we call that a oligotrophic, essentially very nutrient poor. Everything that is there is recycled. And the reason I bring all this up is because there's just a recent study that was looking at what kind of an impact parrotfish have on their ecosystem around them. And what they found was that nearly 70% of all the sand in Hawaii, on all the Hawaiian beaches, they estimated was actually produced by parrotfish eating coral, eating other things, and then essentially pooing out and producing sand, which is incredible.
So the sand in Hawaii is parrotfish poop?
Yes. The next time you're enjoying a very romantic stroll down the beach somewhere, just remember that you're standing on millions and millions of parrotfish poos.
Isn't it incredible how everything is connected and how every species has a unique role to play in the overall ecosystem? And every single species is so important to the overall balance and health of the system. And there are things that they're like unsung heroes. There are things that we don't even understand or realize or haven't studied yet, and how they contribute to the health of the overall ecosystem. So that's such a incredible and funny story to tell because that's not something I knew. And I don't think a lot of people knew about that. I think we think that sand is like crushed up rocks from erosion or crushed up coral from erosion over years or hundreds of thousands of years of erosion from either wind or water near the coast, and that just kind of creates sand. But to know that fish poop actually contributes to sand is really incredible. So I'd love to ask you about maybe one or two more unusual or unique aspects of marine life that you witnessed that you'd maybe like to share with people so that we continue to have an appreciation of the ocean and marine life before we move on to the next question.
Of course, of course. So maybe let's talk about the clownfish or the anemone fish, which people probably know as Nemo. So the clownfish is a fish that has evolved to live symbiotically within an anemone itself. So when you see a clownfish, often it's right inside of a plant or an animal that's, has its anemones and its tendrils that are moving about in the water current. So that anemone is actually quite toxic, and it will shock and oftentimes can actually kill or paralyze any other fish that haven't been evolving to live with it. The clownfish, or the anemone fish as it's known, or Nemo, has evolved this mucus that essentially allows it to exist within that anemone without getting stung or without dying, essentially. So it's evolutionarily quite a brilliant tactic. But the reason I bring up this anemone fish is because a lot of the research that's been done to kind of crack these codes of how fish work on reefs have been done on anemone fish. And so, for instance, when you go and you look at an anemone, if that has clownfish on it, normally it should be 5. And so the reason that we know this is because they've done all these studies where they've removed 1 fish, 2 fish, 3 fish. Maybe we're going to remove 1, or we're going to remove 3, or we'll remove the largest or the smallest, and then looked at what happens in the rest of that little fish family. And so what's interesting is that of these 5 fish, the largest fish is a female, and she rules the roost. And then the other 4 fish are males, and they all have very distinctive size categories. So you can look and you can say, that's the largest, second largest, third largest, fourth largest, smallest. When researchers have gone through and removed that female, what happens is you only have 4 fish on that anemone for a while. They're all males. The largest male will actually change sex, become a female, and then move into that top slot on that specific anemone. And at some point, another anemone fish will recruit in as the smallest male. The other really cool thing about anemone fish that we've learned from studying, and some of my colleagues here at JCU have kind of found out this information, is that typically when a fish breeds, you have all these tiny little larvae fish, like tiny, your eye can't barely see them. And then they go out into this big blue, and depending on the fish species, they can be out in the big blue or in the pelagic part of the ocean from anywhere from like 20 to 60 days. And imagine like you just have been born and your parents tell you, okay, now go out in the desert and survive for up to 2 to 3 months and do this all on your own without any help. And so, in marine biology and in coral reef biology, for the longest time, this idea was that fish are essentially these helpless creatures that are just like, you drop an orange in the water and that orange gets pushed somewhere by currents. And this is literally how they used to study currents, was dropping thousands of oranges in the water and seeing where they disperse towards. The same idea was that fish are these helpless creatures that just go out and they get pushed wherever they go, and it's just all fate. But what they found over time, again, a lot of the research being done here, is that fish, even at that very small larval size, are able to go up and down to find different currents that they can then use to navigate. And so after this long period of time where they're out in the blue, and it's a very dangerous time for them because survivorship is quite low, they can actually navigate back home to their home reef. And they do this both by scent and by hearing the reef. So they hear all the snap crackles that you hear when you're underwater diving. If you're on a really healthy reef, you'll hear all this snap crackle pop that's going on. That's not just your ears, it's actually the sound of a very healthy reef. And so fish use that sound to navigate back, and they know the soundscape and the sound signature of their home reef and the smell of their home reef. So they can make their way back from potentially thousands of kilometers back to the same reef that they were born except rather than coming in, and this is anemone's fish specifically, rather than coming in right next to where mom and dad are, because if that was the case, you have the potential for essentially inbreeding. They come back to the home reef, except they move to the town right next to mom and dad. So they're just far enough down the reef that ensures the breeding capacity of these anemone fish and that population is maximized.
This is so much fun to talk about. I'm having a blast learning about this, and my mind is blown that these tiny little creatures are that intelligent. Also goes to show how incredible Mother Nature is and how the design is so intricate and so high level that it's mind blowing. So thank you for sharing all of this. Part of the intention of this podcast is to really shine a light on not just the beauty, but the intelligence of the ocean. And I know there's so much about the ocean that we still don't know. I would love to ask you what it looks like to study the ocean. I know you've been on many field trips for weeks on end. I'm sure a lot of it is beautiful and glamorous, but I'm sure it's also difficult. What does it look like to actually learn about different marine life?
So it's a great question, and it's one that I think many people oftentimes, when they think of a marine biologist, they essentially envision this life of swimming with whales and dolphins, saving turtles that have a plastic straw stuck up its nose. And at the best of times, yes, that is the case. Oftentimes, though, I spend a lot of time here in my office at a computer. And as you get more and more senior, you spend more and more time in the office writing, analyzing, and essentially bringing in money for your PhD students to go out and do the actual field work. But when we're in the field, let's talk about that a little bit. One of the reasons I went specifically into coral reef biology is because a lot of other marine biology or oceanography is done on very large seagoing vessels that are going out into big weather for months on end. You're on a boat. That wasn't that interesting to me. So I wanted to do something that was a bit more like go out on the reef for the day, dive, see really beautiful things, essentially like, in my opinion, heavily biased, but the most beautiful ecosystem you could ever lay eyes on. You go out, you count fish for the day, you come back, do your data entry on land, and repeat again and again and again. So in coral reef biology, a lot of what we're doing and studying is we're studying the kind of accessible parts of the reef. So typically a lot of your studies on coral reefs are done within 20 meters of the surface, simply because that's an easy way to dive and to have enough air to do something substantive. So when we're going out and we're studying reefs, we're essentially going through and we're doing what we call an underwater visual census, or a UVC. And so what that looks like, depending on the team, you've got all these big transect tapes that are about 50 meters long. And so when you'll go in, you'll have somebody that'll have like 5 or 6 of these things stacked up on their chest. And you use that to measure how long of a distance you're going down the reef. And you're counting every fish that you see within that transect, within perhaps, typically it's like 5 meters on either side of that transect. So you're going through, you're saying, okay, this is this species, it's this large. We saw it at this distance, essentially. And you go through, you count everything that you see on the way there and on the way back. And in that case, you're counting the entire population of fish within a representative sample of that reef. A really good point to make is that, again, when you think about an ideal day in the life of a marine biologist, you see this beautiful placid ocean, right? And I think, Alia, you're a kiteboarder, aren't you?
Yes.
Yeah, so normally you're probably looking for like 20 knots of wind to really be able to go out and have great wind for your kiteboard to be going out and surfing, right?
Okay, yeah.
There's a joke here on the Great Barrier Reef that it's like a day in the life of a marine biologist. You're going out and you're working in 20 knots of wind. So some of the other stuff that we do is we go and we collect species, or so we collect fish, and then we have to go and like start processing samples. And to process samples, you're on the back of a very wavy boat. Some of them are very small, doing this the whole time, and you're looking down and concentrating the whole time, which can lead to seasickness. But one of the things we're doing is, for instance, if we're trying to figure out how old this fish is, we're actually examining their ear bones. And you're having to go through and essentially do brain surgery where you're cutting through the top of the skull, you're going down with a forceps, and you're trying to find this tiny little pearl, which you can then extract and pull out. And eventually you can cut the rings, or the annual growth rings, just like you would on a tree, to age the fish itself. So, in the best case scenario, it's a beautiful day, the sun is out, it's not raining, it's not windy. you're enjoying your best life. But I would say 95% of all the field work I've done here on the Great Barrier Reef, the wind is blowing, it's rainy, the conditions are challenging, and that's kind of what really makes or breaks a trip, which you never know. But typically we'll be out for 3 weeks maybe at a time, doing a specific type of sampling, working 12 hours a day, very rarely taking many breaks, and then doing data entry at night. So they're quite intensive field trips. Over time, they can get a bit arduous and a bit tiring, but also at the same time, that's kind of what separates the professionals from the amateurs.
Well, speaking about weather, I would love to pivot this conversation a little bit into climate change and conservation. And I'd love to get your insights on how climate change is affecting the ocean, but also what the role of the ocean is in climate change or in weather patterns.
Great question. There's a lot that we could say about it, but most simply, the role that the oceans play, many times you've heard like the rainforests are our lungs, the oceans are actually our lungs of our planet because they absorb far more carbon dioxide and produce far more oxygen from seagrass, from algae, from zooxanthellae, all these different organisms. The ocean acts as a buffer. And by a buffer, I mean essentially it keeps us from having these extreme temperatures. And so the ocean absorbs a lot of sunlight. And so in that way, it essentially buffers the amount of sunlight that's being absorbed by land. It's producing oxygen while it's doing it. It's absorbing carbon dioxide. So oftentimes we think of an ocean as something that we call a sink or a carbon sink. So it's absorbing carbon and it's putting it down into the very bottom of the seafloor rather than releasing it. So the oceans do a lot of things for us. Not only do they breathe for us, but there's also these really large currents. There's those 7 or 8 of them that exist in all the oceans of our world. And these currents are responsible for moving either water up from the depths into the more shallow parts. So typically that water is quite cold. It's really great if you have a coral reef that's bleaching. If you get upwelling that's coming up from the bottom, it cools everything down. But it also, if you think about, your standard map of the globe where you have North America on one side and Europe on the other side and the Atlantic is in the middle, there's this big current that's becoming more and more publicly known called the transatlantic conveyor belt. And what that does is it circulates all the water in the Atlantic from the North Americas over to the UK and then down. And so what that's doing is it's actually keeping the UK quite mild as far as climate goes, because when you look at the UK on a map, it's actually located quite high up in latitude. And so if that transatlantic conveyor belt wasn't working to bring warm water through, the UK's climate would be so much worse. And so the reason why this kind of transatlantic conveyor belt is known is because there's been a few studies suggesting that it's actually slowing down quite a bit because of climate change and because of the changing temperatures. And if that continues, it might collapse. Now, if that collapses, the UK might see winters that are full of snow and ice much more frequently than we see today, which typically in the UK you get a few days of snow and it's normally up in the northern parts of the country. So in general, the oceans buffer and the oceans kind of keep things stable as far as the Earth's climate. The other side of that equation is what effects of climate change having on the oceans. And I would say they're having a lot of effects on the oceans. As I said, they absorb a lot of sunlight, so they get warm. They're absorbing a lot of carbon, which is in our atmosphere at record levels. And when they're doing that, essentially the ocean starts to acidify. And if the ocean acidifies too much because it's absorbed too much carbon, what happens is that things like coral reefs can no longer build because they're relying on less acidic oceanic water to be able to build and to grab the nutrients and the minerals that they need to build those exoskeletons. So that's a big issue with climate change is not only are oceans getting warmer, which leads to more bleaching, but also they're actually coral reefs themselves are less able to build that kind of hard exoskeleton that we rely on and that we see for coral reefs.
I'd also like to add something about carbon and how the oceans are so important in balancing our climate and our weather patterns. Because I have a background in sustainability as well, this is something I've studied, and I really want the listeners to have a good understanding of how important this cycle is. So carbon is naturally found in our biosphere. It's in all living things. And we also have carbon as a gas and in non-living things. And this is natural and healthy and balanced. Our sinks and our lands are very much part of the carbon cycle in the sense that they absorb, or what we call sequester, carbon from the atmosphere to keep carbon levels in a healthy state. Most people think about sequestering or absorbing carbon from the atmosphere, they think about forests or trees. And although we do need healthy forests and trees to sequester or absorb carbon from the atmosphere, which we call sinks, any area that is absorbing carbon from the atmosphere is a sink. The number one most important sink to keep carbon in check and regulated and balanced and healthy is our oceans. And also when you discuss how oceans are becoming more acid because of this accumulation of carbon in the ocean, I just want the listeners to think about their favorite fizzy drink or soda water. When you add those carbon bubbles to water, it lowers the pH of that drink. It turns it more acidic as opposed to regular water. Same thing when we're having a lot of carbon coming into our soils because it's being sequestered or absorbed by our trees, which then build carbon in the soils, as well as when you have that gas exchange at the kind of top level of the ocean and it's absorbing carbon, it becomes a little bit more acidic. And again, this is healthy and normal and part of the carbon cycle. The problem is when we have too much carbon being emitted into the atmosphere, then we start to have extremely acidic soils. And then, of course, our oceans become a little too acidic, and therefore it starts to affect the living organisms or the ecosystems in those spaces. So you spoke about the UK and the weather patterns there. Can we maybe talk about globally what's going on when our oceans are not cared for or how our oceans are impacting global climate change?
While I'm certainly not an expert in this, I can kind of tell you the broad overview. So, oceans for many, many years have essentially acted as buffers. They've kept things stable. But what's happening now is we're kind of entering a period where we've pumped too much carbon, pumped too much nitrogen into our atmosphere, which is then being absorbed into the oceans. And so, what we're seeing now is the oceans are starting to kind of lose their ability to maintain the status quo. So, sea levels are rising. And essentially, we're seeing more and more coastal habitats being inundated. So people are starting to have to move further away from the actual coastline. And we're starting to see more and more kind of volatile weather. So as these oceans are kind of reaching the level of like we can only take so much abuse before things kind of hit a tipping point, we're starting to kind of reach that a little bit. And so globally, what we're seeing is much more frequent and much more extreme weather events. So these 100-year floods or 100-year rainfalls or 100-year droughts are occurring much more frequently than we would normally see otherwise. The oceans have all these different currents that circulate the waters and keep our climates kind of predictable and stable. And unfortunately, we're starting to lose that resilience that the oceans provide. So we're entering into kind of a new era where climate and weather is going to become more and more variable and more extreme.
What are some of the other biggest threats to our oceans or marine life outside of rising temperatures and carbon? Why did you decide to specialize in fisheries?
Sure. So the biggest threat to the oceans today, number one, 100% is man or humanity. We are everywhere all the time. We have incredible technologies that allow us to reach very deep into the ocean, and we're a very extractive species. So essentially, we're always extracting things from the oceans, whether it's for our food, whether it's even to build that next pharmacological drug. All these things are coming from the oceans. So as far as man goes, we've talked about climate change. Kind of two of the other really big issues in my eyes are overfishing or illegal fishing, and also pollution. So again, direct effects of man on the ocean is the biggest threat to our ocean's health, without a doubt. You asked me why I got into fisheries. I got into fisheries because there's so much less known about marine fisheries than there is about freshwater fisheries. You know, a very commonly used kind of quote to describe the difficulties of marine fisheries and studying marine fisheries is essentially it's like you're a forester and you're trying to count all of the different trees, but the trees are invisible and they're always on the move. So it's quite a complex challenge to do. And it's also because, you know, fisheries can be incredibly sustainable sources of protein and everything else, but we have to get it right. And so if we're extracting too many fish, if we're having too much of an impact on those fish populations, we're going to drive them to extinction. So this is exactly what we saw with whales back in the 60s and 70s. We'd whaled after World War II as this great source of energy, of oil, of all these other kind of attributes that we were using whales for. Typically, meat wasn't the most important part. But we whaled to the point where all these species were on the brink of extinction. And luckily, this was one of the first cases of really successful global conservation where people banded together and put pressure on their governments to essentially stop whaling. And so now today we're seeing these humpback whale populations that are almost close to what they were originally thought to be. And that's simply because we stopped fishing them. We left them alone, except for Japan and Iceland and a few other countries that continue to whale under traditional fishing rights. The vast majority of whales have been protected, and the vast majority of them have bounced back quite quickly with just a little bit of help from us.
I guess the main message here is that when you leave nature alone, it, as you said, is incredibly resilient and it can bounce back. The numbers can come back. And not that I know a lot about fish or their breeding patterns, but I know that in one kind of, what would you call it when they kind of give birth to eggs in one, what's the word for it?
Spawning
In one,
aggregation?
yeah, in one spawning event, you have millions of babies. So if you just leave some fish ecosystems alone, again, for lack of a better description, you can have that ecosystem bounce back, the population bounce back, because in one spawning event with two fish, they have millions of babies between them, correct?
Yes, absolutely. And so, like, yes, it's great to essentially emphasize if we just leave it alone, it will bounce back. The other thing that I want to emphasize is that there's still so much that we don't understand about the ocean. Attenborough, I think, came up with this quote of, we know more about the surface of the moon than we do the depths of our oceans. And that's relatively true, especially when you're talking about very deep parts of the ocean. Coral reef biology really got its start in the 70s, so it's only about 50 years old. It's quite a young science and quite a young discipline. But even within those 50 years, we've learned so much, but there's still so much less that we still don't understand. And so what I want to kind of drive home to people is that while we assume if science hasn't proved it's true, it's not true, I would argue that our scientific tools are still so coarse that there's so many interesting things that are happening in the world and in our oceans today, but we simply haven't figured out how to actually measure it or discover it. And so many people, if you ask somebody what's the biggest organism on the planet, they might say it's the blue whale, or they might think of an elephant, or if they've really started tuning into stuff, they might say it's panda, which is this quaking aspen in Utah, I believe, which is like 106 acres of one type of aspen, and it's a clonal species. But the problem is, as we've learned more, panda is no longer the largest organism in the world. The largest organism in the world is a seagrass meadow in Shark Bay in Western Australia. And this seagrass meadow spans almost 200 square kilometers. Again, it's a clonal organism, which means essentially every piece of seagrass that comes up is genetically identical to the one that was before it, the one that was before it, the one that's after it, everything around it, the exact same genetically. But the really interesting thing was this whole 200 square kilometer meadow of seagrass originated from one clonal stem about 4,500 years ago. And we didn't know this until like last year. So this is incredibly fresh off the press. Amazing finding that was right under our eyes the whole time. And so the really interesting thing is this organism has been around for 4,500 years. That's well beyond kind of like modern history. And that's back into the days of the Romans. And so imagine what this organism has seen and has experienced. And as science, as I said, as science becomes better and better at understanding how organisms communicate, whether or not they're sentient, all these things, like imagine the wisdom or the knowledge or the memory that this 4,500-year-old organism has that we still haven't learned how to share. And we're just starting to figure out, like, trees communicate with one another. They use a mycelium network to do so. They're far more sophisticated, far more complex than we ever understand. I can guarantee you that in the ocean, it's leaps and bounds above that because the oceans are where life originated. This is where everything started, this primordial soup where you and I began. And we're only really starting to develop the technologies and the abilities to really start disentangling these kind of root concepts and root principles of how everything is related and how it all fits together.
So, with the intention now to think about how to protect our oceans, what are some of the most promising innovations or advancements that you know about that can help us preserve our marine life?
And speaking as a scientist, I think one of the first things that pops into my head is like essentially this ability to monitor the oceans from the satellites of the sky and to see what's happening in these very remote places, because in fisheries one of our biggest issues is transparency. And so what I mean by that is it's very hard to know that the fish that's on your plate came from this place, came from this stock. The stock was very healthy. It then went through this chain where it was bought by someone else, it was processed by someone else, it went to here, went to here, went to here. So there's this whole issue in fisheries where they're not transparent. They can change the name of a fish when it gets to your plate. Your Chilean sea bass is a Patagonian toothfish. That was a huge different changing of a fish's name to make it palatable to you. Google Patagonia toothfish, you'll see how ugly it is. The vast majority of people will probably never want to eat it. So transparency is a big one. And the technologies that we're using, like satellites to be able to track where boats are fishing, to understand what's happening. They're using camera monitoring on a lot of these fishing boats now. They're all really great, and they're kind of like increasing our knowledge about what's going on. But I would say probably the most powerful technological advancement that we have that we can leverage for conservation is actually social media. And we've seen social media be leveraged for all sorts of nefarious pop culture, potentially negative things in the world. But, we haven't really discussed much of what I do in my day-to-day today as more of a conservation psychologist than a marine biologist. But I'm here to tell you that social media has garnered and really enabled these incredible transformations in our cultures today. So if you look back at the Black Lives Matter movement, Me Too, the Arab Spring, perhaps not the poster child of substantial and significant positive change, but still, we've seen all of these instances where movements have swept across the globe very quickly. And it's all because social media has enabled us to continue to communicate with one another simultaneously across the planet. And in my eyes, this is something that is only beginning to really be acknowledged and understood by scientists like myself, because scientists commonly are so focused on describe a trend, describe a trend, describe a trend, what's happening, what's happening, what's happening. And we're not always as good about communicating to the general public. And it really depends on kind of what you believe the role of a scientist should be. Many people are just like, all I want to do is count fish, tell you about what's happening with fish, write a paper about fish, and then somebody else like David Attenborough can go out and say, these are the bigger things that's happening. But as we're evolving and as we're moving into the 21st century as scientists, more and more we're understanding that we already have so much science about what's going on, but there's been a huge gap where scientists have been unable to communicate with the public. And I think social media is going to be one of these tools that really enables scientists to get into the intimate spaces of an individual that wants to know about what's going on in the ocean, what's going on with sharks, what's going on with turtles. Social media is probably going to be that tool that really drives change and motivates substantial parts of our population to start shifting the narrative around what's responsible, what's sustainable, and what we care about.
I guess what you're saying is that social media has this incredible power to influence us, to influence human behavior, to influence social norms. And since you are a conservation psychologist, you are greatly concerned with human behavior and the psychology of how to influence human behavior. So that, if you said that the greatest threat to our oceans is man, then your number one concern is how to shift man's thinking and their behavior to then protect the ocean. So I can see what you mean as for using social media as this tool to maybe change the way we look at the ocean, change the way we value it. If we value it, we protect it. Maybe change our food system, maybe change the way that we interact with this environment. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. And so, as science matures and as we start very multidisciplinary kind of investigations of science, there's some really interesting things that are coming out. So, on this idea of social media, there's this kind of thing that's called social contagion theory. Social contagion theory takes the way that we study diseases and how diseases spread throughout the world and applies it to social, culture, and phenomena. And so what we know is that essentially these tipping points exist within our cultures where if there's 20% of our population that really prescribes very heavily to something. So let's talk about like Black Lives Matter. You get 20% of that population, and when they're very vocal and they're very committed, they can actually flip the other 80% of the population into caring about these things. So the norm is essentially switched very quickly. And that's why things like Black Lives Matter, the Arab Spring, Me Too, why it seems like they kind of emerged out of nowhere and took the world by storm. But what was happening is there was these small committed groups, maybe conservationists, very committed about one specific thing. And as soon as there's a spark that happens, you can see widespread change that happens so quickly, you'd never believe it was a possibility before it happened. And then afterwards, you're left with a completely different kind of phase change shift in civilization and in culture in general.
What is some advice you'd like to leave us with when it comes to considering the oceans, the marine environment, the marine organisms? So we vote with every dollar, with every purchase. So is there some advice that you want to leave us with in terms of what we're buying, how we're buying, or even just as tourists, when we go into the ocean, we scuba dive, we snorkel, what are things that we can do? What are things that we can consider? How would you like to advise us?
Great question. We could go a lot of different ways with that, but I probably want to focus when you ask about what we can do when we're going in the ocean. If you've ever heard of the leave no trace kind of motto behind camping, I would suggest the same thing occurs in the ocean. Leave no trace that you were there. And so whenever I'm in the water, the last thing that I want to do is have the next person come behind me and see visual evidence that I've been there. So that could be not shooting fish, not eating fish. This is, all personal kind of decisions that you should make. But essentially, when we think about something, once we learn to love it, we're much more likely to protect it. And once we think that something can be saved, we'll actually save it. And so my general advice is don't give up hope, because there's such a deluge of doom and gloom around the future of our planet and our ecosystems. And, to be very clear, yes, science shows us that we are going in the wrong direction and that we are really having an impact on our planet and on our oceans. But what science also shows us, if you look around the fringes and if you're not looking at the mainstream media, is that there's so much incredible work that's being done to not only like recover or protect, but to actually bring things back into a better state. And so it really depends if you're looking at the world with the lens of the glass half full or the glass half empty. There's so much left to be saved and there's so much good work that's happening. It's just up to us to kind of continue to weather the storm and to think about, as you said, how we are voting with our dollars. So if you go to a restaurant, if you're eating fish, ask the manager, ask the waitstaff, do you know where this fish comes from? And even if they don't, what we're trying to do is essentially say your consumers care about where this fish is coming from. And if more and more people ask about that, any of these businesses that rely on consumer dollars are incredibly responsive to our individual preferences, decisions, and opinions. So that means that a lot of these businesses will probably change quite quickly. If we don't source sustainable seafood, we're going to lose our customers. You'll see change overnight. And we've seen it time and time again. Being informed is one thing. Learning about the oceans is another. I would say, to be quite honest, the best thing we can do for the oceans is just to get out and to visit them. Hopefully you're not using a huge carbon budget to go out and see it, but the more people are interacting with the ocean, the more we're going to love it and the more we're going to be likely to try to save it. Because again, if we have only grown up seeing the ocean in a documentary with David Attenborough, we don't have that visceral connection with it that we do if we've grown up swimming in its waters, if we've grown up being serenaded by the sound of the waves lapping on the beach at night. These types of deep, deep ephemeral connection are the ones that are going to really drive continued change. And they're the reasons that I continue to wake up and to do the work that I'm doing, even in the face of all this negativity, this despair, this doom and gloom, and this that we as a collective society, and especially the younger generations, are experiencing as we kind of think about what the world is now and what it's going to look like, not only for us, for our children, for our grandchildren. Yeah, so when it comes to making decisions about whether you're going to eat fish or eat meat, that's a very personal decision to be made. If you've decided that you're going to eat fish, one of the best things that you can do is try to ensure that it's a sustainably sourced fish. And so there's a group called the Marine Stewardship Council, or the MSC. They have a blue tick on any of the fish products in a store that are sustainable. And the MSC has gotten a bit of a bad rap from Seaspiracy and these other kind of documentaries that are trying to make it out that nobody cares. But they are very rigorous in the way that they go through and assess whether a fishery is sustainable or not. So when I'm in a grocery store, or if I'm at a restaurant, if I see the MSC tick, it's like, okay, that's the most confidence that I have that this is a sustainably sourced bit of protein. Now, when it comes to our decisions to eat or consume, you have a lot of different people that are telling you have to be vegan, you have to be plant-based, you have to be this, you have to be that. I'm not here to tell you what you should and should not eat. Do I eat meat? Yes, I do. And when I'm eating that meat, in the best case scenario, I've harvested that meat myself, whether it's fish or something else, or at least I know where it's come from, or it's local. If you eat local, you eat something that you've harvested yourself, it's going to be more nutritious because we know that the longer it sits on a shelf, the less it has actual nutrients in it. And it's going to be much more likely that it has a low carbon footprint, and it's just going to be a fresh, good quality kind of product. So that goes for whether you're eating fish or whether you're eating vegetables. Eat local, eat from somebody that you know, that you trust, and hopefully from a place that isn't pumping a lot of chemicals or antibiotics into the fish themselves.
So to reiterate for everybody, leave no trace, no garbage, no plastic, no pollution when you're going to visit these environments, whether it's the ocean environments or land environments, wherever you go, leave no trace. When it comes to seafood, guys, please ask where this fish comes from. The more that we ask, the more that we put pressure on the suppliers. As Brock was saying, we're basically showing the suppliers or the restaurants or the supermarkets that we care. And when we show that we care, they will start to respond. Look for the MSC tick. It might not be the most perfect certification out there, as we've seen from different documentaries, and they're doing some pretty good work to ensure that most of the fish and most of their products is caught sustainably or line caught, so there's no bycatch, which means sharks or dolphins being tangled up in the nets, etc. And lastly is try to eat as local as possible. Know where your food is coming from. If you can, as Brock said, harvest the food yourself, that's great. But if not, try to eat as local and as fresh as possible. And just learn more. If you care about the environment or you care about protecting the environment, the more that you learn, the more that you're an informed consumer, the better. Brock, thank you so much for this conversation. I not only had so much fun talking to you, I also learned a lot speaking to you. I'm so grateful for your time. I'm pretty sure there'll be a part 2. So everyone listening, if you found this topic to be interesting, I'm sure Brock and I will do another one, and we'll go deeper into different topics that we highlighted today superficially. Hopefully we can do a deeper dive, no pun intended. And I look forward to many more conversations with you. Thank you.
My pleasure. It's great to be here. And if you don't mind, I'll leave with a quote that is typically always right next to my desk. And it's from my favorite scientist and my favorite human, who I don't personally know, but Albert Einstein. And I'll leave you with this quote because I feel like it underlines and emphasizes everything that we've discussed here today. And it's one of my general messages for the public. And that's look deeply into nature. And when you do, you'll understand everything better. So with that, thank you very much for the time. And I hope I do get to see you again.
I will leave Brock's links below. So if anyone wants to connect with him or reach out to him, you will have his information. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Please share with family and friends that you feel could benefit from this episode, and make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a rating and review to support the show. Check out the links below for more information about my guests and where to find them. And make sure you're following me on Instagram at wholesome_practice to learn more about what I do. I appreciate you being here, and see you on the next one. This podcast is for educational purposes only and should never replace the advice of your doctor or physician. Always consult a medical professional before making any changes or adding anything new to your diet, lifestyle, or medication protocol.